Good morning, Lord Barker. Thank you so much for joining us this morning for our celebratory event, Game Changers. It's our 20th anniversary, and I couldn't think of a better person to help us to do a look back over what the changes have happened over the last 2 decades.
Well, good morning, Nina. I'm absolutely delighted that you've peered into the archives and dusted me down and pulled me out. So here I am, blinking into the daylight.
Yeah, I was looking through the archives, as you say, and not too much dusting down because really you were a very influential minister in those times. In fact, you were the minister when I joined as chief exec of the REA, and I was impressed with some of the plans that were afoot at that time.
Well, I was very lucky to be there at a very important time in the development of the whole renewable economy. And so I think I was very fortunate to be there at such a critical time, at the launch pad of what has become a tremendous industry for Great Britain.
I think it is extraordinary. So if we do this looking back, and if I can pick your brains and into your views of the history, what did you see the energy landscape was like back then, and what were your priorities then as minister in government?
Well, if I look right back, it's now 16 years since I went to the Arctic with David Cameron and the famous Huskies, and pointed to global warming and called for a climate change act. That act was then subsequently passed by the Labour government with strong cross-party support, and I think was a real triumph of shows what happens when politicians at Westminster actually choose to collaborate. I think it has really stood the test of time. And from that architecture of the Climate Change Act came forth the ambitious policies to really redesign, reimagine the British energy sector. And so when we came into office in 2010, although there had been some limited renewables deployment, we were really coming from a very low base. There had been what you might almost call a false dawn for the wind industry, and solar, which I had a particular passion for, not because I was a particular fan of the technology, but because I was very keen to put more renewable energy into the hands of consumers, into the hands of communities and small businesses. And solar PV was the most adaptable and user-friendly of the technologies out there. I think in solar, there was something like 40 megawatts in total.
Really?
In 2010. And I checked the National Grid dashboard before coming on this morning. And I think we're looking at something like 16% of the UK's electricity this morning. Probably it's going to be even more as the sun hits the noonday peak. Is 16% is being generated by solar PV today, and that compares to something like 14% for nuclear and 2% for coal. So it's an extraordinary achievement, and that's just one of the basket of remarkable renewable energy technologies. Perhaps the biggest driver of all, though, has been the wind industry.
Yeah.
I mean, I can't claim a lot of credit for that. That was very much a group effort when we came into office with my old colleague Chris Hoon and Charles Hendry, and we sat down really with a sort of blank piece of paper, because although we as Conservatives had devised a plan for energy reform in opposition, everything had to be thought through again, because of course we came into power in a coalition. Yes. And so we sat down with Chris, and really with a blank piece of paper, almost taking the cue from the work that we'd done in opposition, constructed the energy market reforms, which really created this extraordinary wind industry. And if you look at now, offshore wind in particular, it's a behemoth. And we then, were worried about the costs and the way in which the cost has come crashing down, exceeding even our most, radical expectations or or projections. It's amazing to the extent to which it's now not just competitive with fossil fuels, but out-competing fossil fuels. It's the most tremendous vindication of all of us who have believed so many years in the case for renewables.
Well, I'm really pleased that we did have you in the early days of my watch as Chief Executive of the REA, because your support for solar in particular, because I remember the solar strategy paper that you published. We were aiming for 20 gigawatts installed by 2020, but nobody believed at that point that we would even get as far as we have got. And we beat those expectations.
When I first came into the department, the then permanent secretary, Moira Wallace, used to giggle every time that I mentioned solar during the ministerial team meetings. They're not laughing now, and
no.
So it's there's nothing like looking back. I mean, not everything was a triumph, but I think if you look at the big things, the way in which the key renewable technologies have matured and developed and grown over the last decade, I think everyone who had an input into that policy framework, and so many of your members, many of whom are still, unlike me, who sort of disappeared into the sunset. Many of your members are still absolutely at the forefront of this, as are you, Nina. You can be really proud of the contribution that they made to policy development and the input that they had during that very formative time to point us in the right direction. And I think the other thing, it's not just that we gave these industries the support, but we did it in a really cost-effective way. I mean, I remember getting a lot of flack for reforming the fixed tariffs for solar in order to make it digressive, because I knew there was a finite amount of money that the Treasury would let me have, and I wanted it to go as far as possible, because my dream was for mass deployment. It wasn't just to make a small number of people very prosperous. It was to spread it as far as it would go, and that's what happened. And then that part of that philosophy informed the market mechanisms that we put in place for wind. But I think it was a really good example. I can think of a few better examples actually of that sort of combination of public money, of public-private partnership in terms of policy development, and actually creating a new industry. It's extraordinary.
There's something I was going to ask you of what you would have done differently over in your watch. What might that have been, Greg? Because you did mention about everybody benefiting.
I would have been even less cautious.
Okay.
I think I would have gone faster, gone earlier, gone harder. I think with the Green Investment Bank, I would have pushed even harder for even bigger funding. I think the GIB played a critical role in those early years, particularly pump priming offshore wind. And again, that's a really good example of smart use of public money to pump prime a private sector growth project. So I think the GIB which I was very involved in, was a great success story. Subsequently, I wish I had objected more when they tried to privatize it, because there's still and did privatize it. And I should have been louder in my criticism and less optimistic about where it was going to head in the private sector. But I think also we need to do more to support the rollout of community energy. I was a big fan of community energy and distributed renewables. We've still got a lot of work to do there. As great as it is to see the big levers of the energy sector on offshore wind, etc., really driving forward, we've still got a lot of work to do. And there we need to link it up, particularly towards demand reduction, energy efficiency, demand response even. And there's a lot, but it's a much more complex landscape. And as a result, you need to be very, very clear and have very in your thinking and strategy, but also clear in the incentives and policy levers that you're going to deploy. Because if you're not, the landscape is too complex to make the sorts of big gains that we've seen elsewhere in the renewables landscape. So I would love to see a more integrated approach to distributed energy and community projects.
It's interesting to think, because with hindsight, you can see how everything's unfolding now. There is so much more around decentralized energy and demand side management, and technology has come so far, you know, even in all the software systems that we're engaging with. I was going to ask you, if you were going to maybe highlight one or two game changers from your watch, as I keep referring to, what would you say that they were? And maybe as we think a little bit further forward, what are the things we need to be looking out for now? Where would you put your $5 worth of investment if you could?
Well, the big game changes I've sort of indicated already was the setting up of the market framework, yes, the energy market reform for wind, which was a massive game changer, and also my reform of the solar tariffs to make them digressive and to push the industry to bring down costs, but also in doing so ensure that we spread that as widely as possible. And we may not have reached the 20 gigawatts that I was hoping for, but that we have transformed the landscape. And it's not done yet. There is still plenty of scope for solar, because it now reached a point where it really doesn't need subsidy. But what it does need, I think, is a careful look at the regulatory framework to make sure that it's easy to connect and easy for consumers and small businesses to actually participate in the energy economy in a way that's profitable for them, rather than highly bureaucratic. So that's something that my successors might look at.
Okay. We're coming close to the end of our time. So what advice would you give the Chief Executive of the REA as we go forward the next 10 years? I'd love to hear that from yourself.
I think the most important thing is have a really clear idea of where you want to get to. What do you want the British energy landscape to look like in 2030? Be ambitious, keep articulating that, and don't take no for an answer.
Okay.
The world's come a very long way. When I was a minister, I was still regularly having quite vigorous discussions with climate deniers, with climate skeptics, people saying this is all a waste of money. What are you doing? You're a green idiot. Those conversations just don't happen anymore.
That's true.
And we have also got I think a really exciting joined up industrial policy around energy now. It's self-evident that the UK renewable energy sector is a huge engine for growth and a huge opportunity and a big employer. So I think government gets that. That wasn't so obvious back in nearly 10 years ago. And you've fought for that recognition, along with your with all of your members, and you've brought that industry so far. So the key thing is just keep going, because there's still a lot to do. Rejoice in our successes, but let's not be complacent, because we've got to drive down the cost even further. We've got to do a lot more on wave and tidal. That's one of the things that I put a lot of effort in, but we've yet to really see the breakthrough that we've seen with other technologies. We're going to have to, it's not renewables, but there's going to have to be some thought about how you get gas off the grid, or if not off the grid, there's going to have to be some form of carbon capture, and that's challenging. And how can that work in conjunction with clean energy? So there's a lot of thought that needs to go into the next 10 years, but I'm still optimistic.
Well, I really appreciate you sharing your thoughts. That's been a fantastic looking back. I wasn't surprised you'd mentioned solar, because it was one of the key areas, and as you mentioned, the Green Investment Bank too. They were pivotal moments that at the time you could not see how it would all unfold, but we are where we are today because of some of your efforts that you did when you were minister. So thank you, Lord Barker, for joining us today. Thank you, Greg.
Thanks, Nina. It's great to see you, and hello to everyone out there.